Welcome to the Court of History. I'm Sidney Blumenthal. This is where the law, journalism, current events, and the constitutional collapse all meet. And I'm here with my colleague, Sean Wilentz of Princeton. I wonder, Sean, how did you spend your weekend? What did you do this weekend?
It was Saturday night at the movies, what else is there to see? It was actually in 3D, although I don't prefer 3D, but there it was. They gave me my glasses, and I saw a film called Superman. And we should, I don't want to give it all away all at once, but I can certainly say that I enjoyed myself a lot.
Don't tell us if he can fly or if he has superpowers. Well, this movie has been seriously attacked by the right wing. The director, James Gunn, said it was a story about an immigrant who came from other places. And it's a story that says basic human kindness is a value and something we have lost.
The politics we'll talk about it. The politics are a little bit more, shall we say, sophisticated and complicated than that. So it's not a simple. I don't know why the right wing. I can see why the right wing's upset, but anyway, it's an interesting movie that is not simply a piece. Certainly not a piece of propaganda. It's very subtle. It's very well done.
Well, I'm dying to see it. From everything I've heard, and especially you, it might be the most sophisticated movie of the year.
Yeah, in some ways, yes.
But they've gone crazy on Fox News about it. They call it super woke.
Yeah. I mean, Lex Luthor may be somebody in this film. Lex Luthor may be, and the embodiment of one of the people that's most powerful within their world. So I can see why they're ticked off.
Well, we'll talk about that. I think we need somebody else who's more of an expert than us on this very important subject involving American civilization, of which there's no more important character than Superman right now. And that is Larry Tye. Larry Tye is a terrific author. He is a New York Times bestselling author of many books of great interest about American history and culture. He's written a biography of Bobby Kennedy. He's written a biography of Joe McCarthy called Demagogue, aptly named, that we'll discuss today. And he wrote a book called The Father of Spin, very relevant, about the public relations pioneer Edward L. Bernays, who I knew and wrote about in my book of 1980, The Permanent Campaign. And he wrote a fantastic book called The Jazz Men about Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Count Basie. And he was also a reporter, needless to say, winning many awards at the Boston Globe. And we really need to bring him in here to talk about the most enduring American hero, not only of our time, but for almost 90 years, the symbol of truth, justice, and the American way, a hero for all times. So welcome, Larry, to the Court of History.
So great to be with you today.
Yeah. Your book, Superman, The High-Flying History of America's Most Enduring Hero, is really a study in American culture and politics. And why don't you start with there are two origin stories here to get us going. One is the story of two Jewish kids from Cleveland, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Tell us their origin story before we get into Kal-El.
Kal-El, yes.
So in The era just before World War II, these two lower middle class kids from Cleveland, Ohio, were in desperate need of a hero for a number of reasons. Jerry needed a hero because his dad had been killed during a robbery at his haberdashery store, and he was bereft and was looking for a personal hero, but also being Jewish on the eve of World War II, these two kids were looking for a superhero to take on villains like Adolf Hitler. And they were looking for a hero who was, with very few disguises, himself Jewish. The notion that they would have a hero who was Jewish, who was strong and able to stand up and defend himself was really important in that era of the Nazis claiming as victims Jews who they wanted the world to believe went passively to their fate in the horrible expression like lambs to slaughter. And that wasn't about to happen to Jerry and Joe's superhero that they created at this very vital moment.
Yeah, Superman, I guess, is kind of the American version of the Golem. And for those who don't know, the Golem is a figure who appears in Prague to rescue the Jews from pogroms. I know both Sean and I separately, although some may say together, were there at this Prague Jewish cemetery where supposedly the Protocols of the Elders of Zion were written. Maybe Sean and I were present. And the Golem, comes out of that history of persecution and the need for a strong figure who's a redeemer.
So it was indeed, and this was their version of the Golem. They didn't know a whole lot about history generally and about Jewish history, but they knew enough that, like Jews in the past who needed the Golem as a hero who would come out of clay and would do brave and valorous things, they created their own hero who, for the last 75 plus years in American history, has rescued us every time that we were in desperate need of a hero, including in the movie that Sean saw over the weekend. I can't think of a moment in our history where at least many of us think that having a hero that we can believe in is really something essential. And maybe DC Comics has given us that.
Yeah. So before we get into how Jerry and Joe got conned out of all their money for creating Superman, tell us about Superman versus the Nazis, because the original Superman, his villains, besides criminals, were the Nazis. He was the champion of the oppressed, as he was called.
Right. So it was a dicey situation in his taking on the Nazis. On the one hand, the whole Jewish backstory to this story, part of the reason he was created was to take on villains like the Nazis. On the other hand, Jerry and Joe, and more importantly, their bosses at DC Comics, didn't want to do a disservice to American troops who were there, who were, along with their allies in Britain and other countries, were taking on the Nazis on a real battlefield and dying over it. So they didn't want to. The question would have been, if Superman had intervened to take on the Nazis, wouldn't he end the war in 15 seconds? Wouldn't it all be over? So they ended up masterfully having Superman defending America on the home front and paying tribute to our troops who were defending America overseas. And it was a way that worked commercially for them. Superman outlasted World War II in the way that superheroes of that era who directly went to battle against the Nazis and the Japanese tended to fade away. Their purpose seemed to be done at the end of the war. And the way that the creators of Superman thread the needle on his involvement in World War II ensured that he had a better chance of surviving after the war. He still had a purpose. We still had a home front that needed defending. And it was a commercial and a storytelling move of genius.
And why don't
Yeah.
you explain to everybody why Clark Kent and Superman, why weren't they in the military? I mean, why wasn't he drafted, taken up? What happened? How did he manage to do that?
Did they need him at home?
He had terrible eyesight, and that was supposedly the reason that he got an exemption from fighting. And it was, they came up with storylines that even 75 years later look brilliant, look a combination of fun and masterful, and they always were. They looked at what the real grounds for exemption were, and they made sure that Clark qualified.
Yeah. So I saw a strip from that period where Superman grabs Hitler and Stalin and brings them to a court to be held to account for their crimes. And that's an interesting one where it's not Superman who's delivering the justice, but the rule of law. So Superman is really the instrument of the rule of law against authoritarian dictators.
So Superman is with all of his superpowers, but I think it's also, and maybe this is self-serving, but where Sidney, as a lifelong journalist, you can relate. I think it's also not accidental that his alter ego was a journalist, and a journalist was going to be the other one who stood up for the rule of law and who was an arbiter of justice. And it was not an accidental profession in picking journalism.
Yeah, well, truth, justice, and the American way is Superman's credo, isn't it?
It is. And isn't that the credo of every journalist, at least in their own head?
Yeah. And as you point out in the book, interestingly, I don't think Jerry and Joe were Talmudic scholars. However, the Mishnah says that the world endures on three things: justice, truth, and peace. And it's no accident, as you point out, that this gets translated.
And it's no accident that Kal-El is close to a Hebrew meaning for an all-embracing system of justice. There were a dozen little hints that these seemingly unsophisticated guys from Cleveland, Ohio, put into their character and their early stories to ensure that you had to be blind not to see their Jewish roots.
So why don't we do that origin story of Kal-El? I mean, let's get into that side of the story.
Yeah, tell about what happens with Superman.
So what happens with Superman is his parents on Krypton, seeing that their planet was going to be destroyed, they send their baby son Kal-El to Earth, where he is rescued by Ma and Pa Kent in the middle of the Midwest somewhere. And it is not just the story of immigrants. And it was really essential. And we'll talk later, I presume, about the immigrant story today. But it was the story of Moses. He's floating on the water and he's rescued. And it was one more way that they put in two different kinds of origin stories. The notion of the wonder and the nobility of the immigrant and the outsider, and the notion of Jewish history telling all that stuff thousands of years ago.
Yeah, but he winds up in the heartland in Kansas. And they're decent people. These are not, they're the most decent kind of Americans, aren't they?
They're decent. They're reflecting what these two kids from Cleveland, Ohio saw self-servingly as heartland kinds of values. Truth, justice, and the American way weren't just general American values. They were values that seemed to have a special place in the Midwest, in the heartland, in not far from Cleveland, Ohio, where Jerry and Joe grew up. But I also think that as people point to this being some great liberal notion of American history, I think situating him in the heartland was also a way of saying these aren't things on the coastal values of America. These are things that real Americans believe in and stand for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there are three characters here. There's Clark Kent is his alter ego. He's Clark now, but he's also Kal-El, who is Superman. Then he gets a job at the Daily Planet, and he meets Lois Lane, who also has an evolution over time. And
She
he
does.
also is dealing with the enduring villain who also morphs over time, Lex Luthor.
That was one of the things that drew me to the Superman story in the beginning was partly that this was our longest lived hero. But I thought that if we looked at why Americans embraced this character of Superman, we would see something not just about him, but about ourselves. And part of the whole ethos of the Superman character is that he has changed and evolved more often than the fruit fly. Every time we needed a different kind of hero and confronted a different kind of enemy, Lex Luthor would morph into that enemy, and Lois Lane would morph into the character of the heroic women of her times, and Superman would give us a hero that seemed perfectly designed for that moment. Everything from his hairstyle to the way he talked to, most importantly, the values that he embodied and the different way that we define truth and justice in that moment, he was a perfect reflection.
Yeah. So let's talk about as historians say, the periodization of Superman. And he comes out of the war, and suddenly Superman and his whole environment is under attack during the McCarthy era. And McCarthy doesn't attack Superman, but there is a man named Frederick Wertham, who engages in a crusade against comic books, including Superman, claiming that they're a danger to children.
So he did. We had, as everybody knows, the Great Red Scare that predated McCarthy, and that McCarthy tuned up in a way that gave it new energy and a scary new power to intimidate people. And at that same moment, Frederick Wertham was inventing the great comic book scare of the era. And he, looking around, decided that rising rates of juvenile delinquency had to have a cause somewhere. And Wertham was a psychiatrist, and he decided that it was the comic books that had enabled juvenile delinquency, that they had made violence somehow noble and given kids a license by reading these sometimes shocking and even scary stories to go out and do their own kind of delinquent activities. And it was a wonderfully convenient way of simplifying what was going on with juvenile delinquency, the same way Joe McCarthy gave us a wonderfully compelling and simplistic answer to what was wrong with American society when he was looking for a red behind every pillar in the State Department.
Yeah, it all takes place at the same time, including a panic about, homosexuals in government that needed to be rooted out, and, communists.
One scare after another.
One
scare after another, and then the comic book scare. And it's,
Wasn't there some policing of the comic books that came out of all of that as well?
So there was a comic book code, and basically before things made it to the newsstands, stories were supposed to be policed to take out anything from nudity to lewdness to violence, and it was basically a censoring of comic books. And it was the reason we are talking this many years later about the comic book scare is it was one of the most dramatic illustrations of a journalistic kind of censorship that we had seen in America. And the scares that you were talking about, the different ones, happened in this order. Joe McCarthy, people may or may not realize that one of Joe McCarthy's earliest targets was Jews. And then it was gays in what was known as the Lavender Scare. And he was basically looking for any scapegoat that would stick with the public to make this backbench senator a more than one-term senator. And the one that stuck when he delivered his famous speech on communists in the State Department was the Red Scare, and was the idea that it was communists, maybe not Jews anymore, and maybe not gays. It was communists who were the real enemy that we had to be worrying about.
Yeah, your book goes into all of this, and it's an incredibly relevant book. Let me read what you wrote here, quoting Richard Revere, who knew McCarthy, was a reporter at the time, later became a writer for the New Yorker, political writer for the New Yorker, where I worked. And Revere wrote, and I'm reading from your book now, and here's your book, and people interested in it should read it. And it says, I'm going to read it. According to Revere, he, McCarthy, built a coalition of the aggrieved, of men and women not deranged, but deeply affronted by various tendencies over the preceding 2 or 3 decades towards internationalism, and in particular, toward closer ties with the British, toward classlessness, toward the welfare state. To these and many others, he was a symbol of rebellion. And beyond all this, he simply persuaded a number of people that he was speaking the essential truth. Sounds like someone else.
So it does. McCarthy, the reason my book was called Demagogue rather than McCarthy is that I was interested, again, in the story of McCarthy as illustrating a story of demagoguery going back to America's earliest days. He was the embodiment of a lot of the demagogues who came before him, and he was the role model for demagogues who came afterwards, whether it was David Duke or George Wallace or people in a more contemporary world that we'll talk about here today.
Yeah, I'm quoting from your book. You write in a chapter which is called The Enablers in your book. Joe McCarthy's most apt student was Donald Trump. Roy Cohn was the flesh and blood nexus between the senator and the president.
So Roy Cohn was the brilliant and arrogant young lawyer that Joe McCarthy hired to run his subcommittee when the Republicans took control of Congress and the White House in 1952. McCarthy took over as chair of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. And instead of just being a bomb thrower in the background, he now actually chaired a very important subcommittee. And he needed a young staffer to come in and help him with his investigations. And he initially thought of promoting a guy who was working for him named Robert Kennedy, who was hired in part because Joe Kennedy had given Joe McCarthy enough money that when he called and said, "My son needs a job," McCarthy said, "I'll hire him." He decided not to go with Robert Kennedy, but instead to go with this young lawyer, Roy Cohn. And Roy Cohn became McCarthy's protege, leading him on lots of investigative exploits that put him more and more out on a limb in terms of charges that McCarthy was making about communism infusing all aspects of American life. And this young staffer, Roy Cohn, half a century later, was hired by Fred Trump to tutor a young Donald Trump who was just entering the bare knuckles world of New York real estate. And who better to teach him how to attack this world and how to give him his playbook than Roy Cohn, who was essentially turning over the Joe McCarthy playbook to Donald Trump.
Yeah, what you write in your book, in your acknowledgments, just to show you how carefully I read your book, that you could never imagine the things that Ethel Kennedy told you.
So Bobby Kennedy, the job that he had with Joe McCarthy was a job, his first real job that he'd ever had. He had just graduated from being smack in the middle of his class at the University of Virginia Law School. And as I mentioned, with the help of his father, he lands this job with Joe McCarthy. But it wasn't just a job. The Kennedys and the McCarthys were great pals, and they were pals enough that, again, 70 years later, when I'm interviewing Ethel Kennedy and asked about the relationship with Joe McCarthy, Bobby Kennedy's children, and he had 11 of them, Bobby Kennedy's children would always try, when I talked to them about Joe McCarthy, to say that this was a young Bobby Kennedy and that they were never really that close. The one who I think got closer to the truth was Ethel, who never denied the fact that they were good friends. And she said that they were good enough friends that her eldest child, Kathleen, had Joe McCarthy as his godfather. Now, that was a great story that Ethel told me. When I ran that story by Kathleen, she said no way was Joe McCarthy her godfather, and that it was Thomas Merton who was her godfather, and she was embarrassed by that relationship. But Ethel said that whatever people thought of Joe McCarthy and what he did during his hearings, that to them, he was just a good-natured, affable guy. And she was using adjectives that I had never heard applied to Joe McCarthy. And that was why, after writing a biography of Bobby Kennedy and doing these interviews with Ethel, I wanted to go and understand who Joe McCarthy really was and how he could have charmed the very smart and interesting Ethel Kennedy to the point where she was describing him the way he did. And what I ended up finding was that in addition to all the bad things that we knew about Joe McCarthy, that he was a charmer, that he charmed America to the point where in the early 1950s, he was the second most popular public figure in the country, trailing only our war hero president, Dwight Eisenhower. And it wasn't just that he was a charmer, it was that he also had enough substance to be able to get away with all the lies that he told. And one of the things that was very surprising to me, so I was trying desperately to get access to the public and private files that Joe McCarthy's widow had left to his alma mater, Marquette University, when he died. And every biographer before me, and there were lots of them, had made efforts like I was trying to make to try to get the files opened. And when Joe McCarthy's widow left the files, she left them with a provision that they would become public when either of two things happened. Either when their then infant daughter decided to open up the records, and she had been saying no to doing that all that time for 70 years, or when she died. And she was younger than me, and I thought, I'm not going to outlast her, so I have to somehow get her to agree to open the files to me. And I thought I was very smart, and I tried every technique that I had learned as a journalist. I wrote to her, I emailed her, I had her great buddy Greta Van Susteren intervene on my behalf, begging her to open the papers to me. I knocked on her door, I did everything. And just at the moment where I had told my wife and my publisher that we sadly weren't going to get access to these, I tried one more thing. I sent her a 6-pack of the best ice cream in America, which is called Grater's Ice Cream. And I sent a very short note, and I said, I have been a pain in the neck to you for a couple of years now, and I want to leave, instead of the sour taste that I think I've left you with, I want to leave you with a bit of sweetness. And at the end of the note, I said, I promise I will never, ever contact you again. And the next week, I got a call from the chief archivist at Marquette saying, we don't know what you did, but she has not just opened the files to you. She has done what is every publisher's dream. She has opened them with a provision that the moment you stop looking at them, we're going to put them back under lock and key. Right. So those files showed, among other things, that Joe McCarthy was, in fact, a war hero during World War II, which all the journalists in Wisconsin at the time had said just wasn't true. And this guy who had sort of dubbed himself and then became disparagingly dubbed by the journalist, Tail Gunner Joe, was in fact going up on very dangerous missions that he didn't have to from his island in the South Pacific. And this guy who was supposed to be a land-based intelligence officer was putting himself at risk of getting shot down.
Larry, you're making a very good point, though, throughout, which is that, we look at demagogues and we sometimes forget their other side, that they can be charming. And in fact, part of their skill, part of their power is that they are so charming. They have another side that we don't want to talk about so much, but lots of people connect to, right? And that sounds very contemporary as well.
So I think what you just said is entirely true, but I've written about people who are both villains to me and are heroes. And I think the same way demagogues have another side, which is part of the reason they kept John in America. People like Bobby Kennedy, whose poster I had on my wall in high school,
Right.
and who remains a hero of mine. He had the dark chapter of the McCarthy era, where he was not just involved with Joe McCarthy, but he defended him to the rest of Bobby Kennedy's life. And our heroes have clay feet, and our villains do heroic things, and that's what makes them all human. And unless we can get at both sides of those people, we're not doing much of a job as biographers or as journalists.
Yeah, but there's another aspect, another element, Kryptonite, and
Yeah, absolutely.
And what brings McCarthy down? What's his kryptonite? Because demagogues are almost always in the end brought down, sometimes by themselves, by their own flaws, and and who is the Superman here? We have seen now the movie and the play, Good Night and Good Luck, about Edward R. Murrow. But you've written a piece in the Washington Post at some time ago when your book came out, and in your book, drawing attention to a now forgotten figure who was a major figure in American journalism, the columnist Drew Pearson.
Yes. So you've said a lot of interesting things here, and if I can just, hopefully in brief responses, respond to
Please,
different parts.
This is what you're here for, Larry.
So my book was, even though it was a dark story about demagogues, my book on Joe McCarthy ended up with what I think is an incredibly reassuring message. And it is, if you give a demagogue, and be that demagogue George Wallace or David Duke or Joe McCarthy, if you give them enough rope, they're eventually going to hang themselves. And given the rope of having this powerful subcommittee where he was investigating everybody, he ended up going a step too far, and he took on the all-powerful American Armed Services. And that was where the members of the Senate, and more importantly, President Eisenhower knew that McCarthy would eventually overreach. And when McCarthy took on Eisenhower's cherished army, Eisenhower fought back behind the scenes in a way that was very powerful, and McCarthy ended up being done in. He made accusations against the military that he couldn't back up. He had two unwieldy staffers named Roy Cohn and his great buddy David Shine, who were behind the scenes doing outrageous things. And essentially McCarthy did himself in to the point where his own subcommittee investigated him. They found him guilty of all kinds of wrongdoing. The Senate censured him. And for the last several years of McCarthy's tenure in the Senate, in the last years of his life, he lost all power. He lost all relationships with his fellow senators. And we see in the records that were released as part of my book, in his medical records, we see that he was drinking the equivalent of a fifth of whiskey every day for the last several years of his life. And he died not from the hepatitis that the death certificate said, but he died essentially of poisoning himself with alcohol. So his kryptonite was, I think, his own insatiable sense of himself and of his power, and forgetting that in the end, the only person who believed everything that Joe McCarthy was saying was his wife and himself. He had forgotten that he was an embellisher and that he was creating things out of whole cloth. And he started believing himself, and he ended up doing himself in. And we see kryptonite introduced by the creators and the early storytellers about Superman, because they realized it would be boring if a hero was all powerful and had no weaknesses at all. So they created this brilliant weakness of him being vulnerable to this kryptonite, which had come down from his planet of Krypton. And there were all kinds of creative ways that kryptonite has been used by Superman's people, his storytellers in the movies, in TV, and in the comic books, to give us new versions of kryptonite. And we had the latest here in this latest movie, which I thought was very fun. and which suggested both his weakness but also how he could overcome it.
Yes, indeed. Kryptonite plays a very important role in this film.
Yeah.
So, Sean, could you tell us the role? And I'd love to comment on a few things about it, but you just saw the movie this weekend, and how did you see Kryptonite there as a fun and new entry?
Well,
into this,
there's a way. I mean, I don't want to give it all away because I don't know how to do it without giving it away.
Spoiler alert: Sean is going to talk about Kryptonite.
Well, I mean, Kryptonite shows up at a very important point in the movie where they're in a kind of pocket universe, as they call it, right? And there are prisoners all around. He's kind of been imprisoned himself. And there's this amazing character. What I can't recall his name. It's a little early in the morning. Who could turn himself into anything in the world, anything, even out of the world. He can just make himself into that or part of him, and he makes himself part of him into Kryptonite. And of course, Clark Kent, Superman is just laid low by this. And it's a very important point of the film where there's a series of things in this film, of course, where Superman's just on the edge of destruction, just on the edge of being taken out. And then somehow he overcomes it, right? It's a cliffhanger in that way. And Kryptonite is right in the middle of all that, right, Larry?
So, yes, right. And I think the way he overcame it was with a characteristic that has defined Superman from his very beginning days, and that was with empathy. And he had empathy for this character who could change himself into anything. And again, without giving away the story, he related to that character in a way that made that character turn from being his enemy and his destructive agent in the form of Kryptonite to saving him. And it was his humanity. And I think maybe we could go as far as saying his immigrant derived empathy that was the heart of this story and has been at the heart of the character from the start.
And it's very much in the heart of this movie too. I mean, at the very end, you see all of that, but go ahead.
Yeah. Superman over time, who began as the champion of the repressed and the oppressed, all that got washed away for years, and now he's still pertinent. In a way, this is the return in the beginning of the return of the original aspect of Superman.
Yes, and anybody who says we can get into to whatever extent you want to the whole discussion of wokeness, but anybody who says that Superman as the empathetic immigrant is a newly derived wokeness about him doesn't know the early stories of Superman. Yeah. Superman, for these two Jewish kids who were Jews in the American diaspora world, they were immigrants and outsiders from the beginning in their world in Cleveland, Ohio. And the character that created was the ultimate immigrant coming down from the planet Krypton. And that was part of the story from moment one, as was his evolving to meet the needs of any given time. And this is not wokeness. This is Superman backstory.
Yeah. Well, Superman. Superman's a friend of yours, and and they don't know who Superman is.
So I think that may be true. I think that they're learning. I have never seen more newspaper space given to a Superman story. Even when Superman was killed, a generation ago, I don't think it got the kind of ink that Superman is getting today. It seems like every day the New York Times has a story, sometimes on the front page, about what the kind of ripples that have been created by this movie. And I think if it gets us talking both about Superman as a wonderful superhero and about political values today, it's a great thing. But I'm not sure when it's going to end. I keep thinking I'm going to stop reading news stories, and then I pick up the next day's paper, and there it is again.
A nation turns its lonely eyes to Superman is what is going on.
Well, truth, justice, and the American way is under siege, and it requires a superhero. And Superman always is conjured out of our own time.
Yes, and whether or not the creators, the controllers of Superman, who are DC Comics and their parent company, Warner Brothers, whether or not they endorsed Superman as a great empathetic immigrant hero in terms of its political connotations, I can tell you for sure as heck, they endorsed the idea that Superman has helped pull Warner Brothers out of its economic doldrums. It's the biggest success they've had in a very long time, and somehow red ink has turned to black over this.
Well, there's a message in that too, because it's the character, but that character had been worn out in blandness, and they've made this character a very much a commentary in his own cultural way again, and made him vital. And he's come and he's rescued Warner Brothers.
He's done that. And I think the three of us are all of a similar enough generation that we know when we were kids, the cool characters to embrace as a kid were the Marvel characters. They were, they seemed to have a more dark side and an edgierness to them. And yet the creator of so many of those Marvel characters is somebody that I interviewed when I was writing my book on Superman, and that was the great Stan Lee. And Stan Lee grew up as a hero of Superman, and Stan Lee, much as he created the anti-Superman characters, his touchstone was always Superman, and the creators of Superman have always figured out a way to make him cool and relevant again. And we're not talking today about the great new movies on Batman or on Spider-Man. It is Superman that is dominating the airwaves and the box offices. And as long as he continues to earn money for DC Comics and Warner Brothers, we'll have new and exciting generations of him come back repeatedly.
Just one small thing about the movie, because Superman actually has on his side, though, some of those other characters. The Green Lantern does show up, and Hawkwoman does show up. So he has managed to take into his fold, if you will, these other characters too. They're all on the same side, as well as the guy who was the Kryptonite figure. He ends up kind of joining them as well.
So you're exactly right. And those characters, the role they played in this latest movie is precisely the one that Jerry and Joe would have envisioned for them from the beginning, which is they're part of the supporting cast. Exactly. The guy who's the star on screen is still Superman, and these others are there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I'm not too young that Superman was not the central comic figure for my life, and he was not a comic figure. When I was a child and had my tonsils out and they were putting the anesthetic on me, I yelled at the nurse, Superman, come save me now. And
did it work?
I used to go very much a typical American boy experience. Used to go to the local swimming pool with my pals, and then we used to go to the local drugstore, which had a counter, and they would also have a rack selling the latest comic books that just came out. I'd get the latest Superman, and we'd drink cherry Cokes, and sounds like Smallville, doesn't it?
So it sounds wonderfully nostalgic, and just the kind of image that I think, and the warmth and the empathy that they're going for today again.
Yeah. I saw that Trump's communications department put out a meme of him as Superman, but he's all alone, and he is a superhero, but he is not an empathetic figure. He's a figure who should be worshipped. He's a godlike figure. That's not Superman, is it?
Not at all.
That's not my Superman.
Yeah. Well, I understand that you got some interest for your book on Joe McCarthy from another president.
I did. So I got a phone call one day just after the book had come out from somebody who said that they were Bill Clinton's press secretary. And I didn't believe it, but decided I would play along with the ruse and call back. And 5 minutes later, a voice turned up on the phone line. There couldn't be anybody but Bill Clinton. There are many voices you can mimic and not that one. And we had what I thought was a wonderful conversation. Bill Clinton came of age in America in the Joe McCarthy era. And I think his entry into politics was partly in response to a lot of things that he was concerned about with McCarthy and McCarthyism. And we had a great conversation about that only got sidetracked because I mentioned that I was working on another book on three people who turned out to be even more important in Bill Clinton's life. And they were named Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Count Basie. And I had a theory in writing a book about them that these three jazz greats in their time off the bandstand had a major role in influencing civil rights history and influencing political history in America. And if I ever needed confirmation of that, it was when Bill Clinton said that they were his inspiration in terms of getting involved to the extent that he did in racial politics in America and in believing in jazz, that it could be a force for good.
Yes. Well, he has told me, and his mother, when she was alive, told me of the formative experience of the integration of
Little Rock High
School in Little Rock. Had a deep and formative impression on Bill Clinton. And so your book on the jazz greats, called The Jazzmen, given Clinton's other interest in jazz as the saxophonist, really melded his understanding as well of what had happened in America and their role. So your book is an important book too.
So can I just say one thing about that Little Rock integration experience? As all of your smart listeners know, Little Rock was a defining civil rights moment of 1957 when a federal judge said that we have to integrate the all-white Central High School and pick 9 black kids to do that integrating. And that was a defining experience for one of my jazz guys, for Louis Armstrong. One day, he was in a hotel room and a young journalist knocked on his door. And Louis Armstrong had been accused by too many journalists and others in America that era of being an Uncle Tom, if not an Aunt Jemima figure. And this journalist knocked on the door and asked him the question, what do you think about what's going on in Little Rock? And Louis Armstrong let it all out with this journalist. He called the racist governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, a word that I won't say in the polite company the podcast, but the word began with M and it ended with R, and it got translated in family newspapers around the world as being an uneducated plowboy. He called our war hero president, Dwight Eisenhower, a gutless so-and-so for refusing initially to send in federal troops to protect those 9 kids. Now, what I'm about to say, I can't prove in terms of cause and effect, but it was not long after that Eisenhower sent in federal troops to protect the Little Rock 9. And I think that Dwight Eisenhower, who adored Louis Armstrong, agreed with Armstrong that he had been gutless in his treatment of that situation. And I think he reversed himself because he thought that Louis Armstrong had gotten it right.
Well, I don't know if that's true, but I want it to be true.
Yeah. Me too.
Yeah. So, the question is going to be, let's just end this by talking about Superman, is going to be, a country that needs a Superman and projects onto Superman. What is the future role of Superman in American society here? He's lived now ever since his birth longer than any figure in popular culture is at the center.
I think he carries 2 messages. One is the message that it's not just Superman that we have to look to, but it is the schlubby guy named Clark Kent, who is his alter ego. And I think what Jerry and Joe were saying is that we each have the potential within ourselves. I think they thought that if especially the girls who they liked who weren't giving them the time of day had looked deep enough, they would see that within these characters of Jerry, Siegel and Joe Shuster, there was a Superman. And I think that lesson is a really important one of Superman. It's not a superhero we're waiting for. It's us looking within ourselves and seeing we have the power to say no, and we have the resilience. And I think that same story is so compelling that whatever the era and whoever the villains, we will have a new incarnation of Superman that greets us with the sense of his heroism and the sense that he is really the Clark Kent figure even more than the superhero.
Well, thank you so much, Larry, for your insights into so many subjects that are so important to all of us today, from Superman to Joe McCarthy to the jazz greats. We really appreciate your appearing on the Court of History with myself and my colleague, Sean Wilentz.
So it was a blast being with you. Thank you both.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.